Good day. Thank you very much for joining. We're just giving it 2 more minutes for people to join and occupy this space before we start. So we'll be starting in 2 minutes. Once again, thank you very much for everybody for joining us this evening. Well, evening for us here in South Africa. Greetings, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and start. Uh, Whoever joins will be joining us as we continue. Just to let everyone know that this session will be recorded, and for everyone who would like access to this recording, it will be made readily available thereafter. I trust that in today's discussion and conversation, there will be a lot of gems, discoveries, maybe some disruptions. And yeah, I think that's why we're all here. Okay, so firstly, I would like to start by just simply introducing myself. If we're not too many today, I would also maybe extend the invitation for people to introduce themselves. But that is all depending on whether it's up to you. So, my name is Shivani Davids. I am the co-founder and facilitator at the Reimagined Learning Center. I've personally been on this unschooling and unlearning journey in community for the past six to 7 years now in community, and a bit longer on my own, just with my making sense of the world. Uh, this year, on this discussion, we're going to be hacking, healing, and unpacking, unschooling, and natural learning. I also think that the context of the world today is super, super, super relevant for conversations such as this, as I feel the world is up for questioning. A lot of parts of our world is up for questioning. And for my interest's sake, I have been deeply invested in interrogating education. First of all, education as it shows up in this world, education as schooling, education as learning, and education as relationship, and thirdly, education as spirituality. Uh, we'll be going in this conversation, we'll be going through the nature of learning, the pros of schooling, the etymology of schooling, uh, different things that inform schooling as it shows up today. And also, most importantly, I think the hacks or the shortcuts uh, to learning, to education, and to schooling. Uh, so that is my experiences in this journey. I'm from South Africa, for those of you that don't know. Uh, the context of where I'm speaking from is in a space or community space that is very similar to a lot of spaces. We're not somewhere far out in a rural area, we're actually in the city. And I found that the context of the city, we tend to feel a lot of the societal cause and effects a lot, and that has informed a lot of the reasoning which I will be sharing as to why, or not necessarily just why, but how the how to our unschooling journey and our hacking and healing of learning and education. Uh, if anybody is keen to share a bit of where they from and what brings them here, I see for now we are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is 5, though I think more would be joining. So for now, if anybody is keen to very briefly just share a bit of where they're calling from and what has brought them here today, I think it will be very interesting just to hear from you guys. So anyone at any time.
Okay, I can introduce myself. I'm Deborah. Can you hear me? I'm Deborah. I have 2 girls. I live in Greyton in the Western Cape of South Africa, and we are unschooling. And my interest, I saw the notice on Facebook, and my interest is to connect particularly with the unschooling community in South Africa and worldwide is bonus, but to understand how other people are navigating unschooling here in particular. So thank you for organizing this discussion.
Thank you very much for that. Very interesting to have you someone in South Africa. Very close.
Yeah.
Not too close. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Unfortunately, not close enough. Yeah.
Hey, yes, indeed. But we're going to be linking and conversating ways to sort that out. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Perfect.
I can go. I'm Lauren. I live in Philadelphia, and I am a teacher in public school. But I've been very. I'm a new teacher, and I've been very dissatisfied and frustrated with the violence of schooling, both as I think about my own schooling and think about the practices that I participate in as a teacher. And I have a friend who is part of the unschooling network and runs a collective here in Philly. I have talked to her very briefly about it. And I'm also going to be helping to facilitate a course in the fall for the teacher ed program that I did, where we're talking about possibly trying to just help new young teachers understand the violence of what schooling is, and possibly look at some other alternatives that are not non-traditional education models. And I'm not sure how I exactly fit because I don't have kids of my own, so I'm not sure the role of non-parents in this kind of work, but I'm just very curious to learn about it.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And yes, indeed, I'm also a non-parent, but at the same time, I am a parent, and we'll be debunking that in our conversation today. Thank you very much for joining us. Sure, but sorry, I was on mute there. I just wanted to thank Adrian. Adrian, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correct. Please forgive me if I'm not, for just texting what brought her to this conversation. And please also excuse the misuse if I am using the wrong pronoun. Oh, okay. I think let's get straight into it, guys. So, learning. What is learning? For a lot of unschoolers, we have used the term natural learning. I think it was John Holt who coined the term in the 70s, unschooling, and he spoke upon the idea that learning through intrinsic motivation brings about far more a learning and an education and a knowledge system that has that's far more resilient and has so much more integrity than schooling or the ideas of how schooling showed up. The famous quote from Mark Twain said, "Don't let schooling interfere with your education." And I think unschooling speaks into this and onto this in such powerful ways. In my personal experiences in observing, which was the main aspect of my unschooling journey, a short introduction of how it came to be. So I came from the normal school sort of pathway where I went to primary school and then went up to high school, and there was lots of disruptions and reasons of doubt that I had in myself. However, it was very difficult to navigate this discomfort in the mass consciousness when we are taught or told that this is the way. And it was eventually when I got to varsity that and note my use of words, I walked out, not dropped out, I walked out of varsity, meaning that I chose uh, to leave the institution due to the reason that I could account for my learning and even extend on my learning without the institutional pressure, without the institutional uh, how can I put it, trigger to promote myself or to fuel the idea of learning. Learning has been happening, and it was in varsity that I actually began accounting for it. Learning was always happening with me. Learning happened in taxis, learning happened in conversations in the street, learning happened at funerals and at weddings. These were all sites of extremely important education that would end up uh, molding me and sculpting me into the person that I am today. I found very little of my personal being influenced by schooling. What is schooling? Schooling being the space, the institutional space that has specific rules and regulations that you need to condition your being to. So what was my frustrations with schooling in my times of schooling? I think I can speak about my most recent frustration with schooling, and that came through the simple act of where a young person which I knew, which was part of the Reimagined Learning Center, who thoroughly enjoyed reading and writing. However, reading and writing was never something done at the desk, or it was never something done with a book in hand. Reading and writing took place by looking at baked bean cans, looking at trucks, looking at different signage, and looking at different words that are on a lot of apparel items. And as soon as I prompted Leah to open up a book and for Leah and asked Leah, could you mind reading? Leah automatically looked at me and said, Sensei, I'm a failure. And I was like, what? Note, Leah is 5 years old and is also gender neutral. They've had the ability to define, or freedom or liberation to define themselves as not no specific gender, but to be gender neutral for their time that they are currently in. So you have this person who is very autonomous and showing such great insight into the world and to them. However, when it came to this prompting to read, it was met with this crazy amount of resistance. The amount of resistance that gave Leah the ability to assimilate and to embody this word failure. That struck a heavy chord in my life, and it made me think, what are we as adults firstly doing? Because in the context of Leah's life, the teacher, before coming to the center, Leah was at a normal school, and the teacher had a higher was put on a higher pedestal than the parent. And I think for a lot of us can relate to that experience of parenting, where the the teacher in the idea of a normal family, or the student goes to school, gets information, and comes home and is met with some resistance, as there maybe could be something that is said in the household by the parents that is in conflict with what is said at school. And 10 to 1, you'd find that the teacher's authority or the teacher's value is higher than that of the parent. So you have this person that is fully influenced by this one adult, which was the teacher at the time, who labeled Leah to be a failure because Leah apparently failed grade 1. And it's because Leah was reading and writing not when they were prompted to, but rather at the time where it showed up in life. And this is when we're going to start speaking about now natural learning and the nature of learning. To pause on that moment, I want us to think about the example of learning to walk. If we had to pay or to try to obstruct or support the learning of a young person's walking by any means possible, this could be with a stroller, and I speak from experiences, this could be with a stroller, this could be with maybe trying to pick up the child to support their walking, we stand the chance of disrupting that natural process of learning. A child is born absorbing. And when I use this word child for the sake of this webinar, this conversation, I want us not to limit it to young people. I want us to maybe relate to the child in us. And when I say child, I refer to the intrinsic magical wonder being that exists within all of us before the tax and the capitalism and the bureaucracy of our society. So when I speak of child, I do not speak of something that I wish to externalize from our being. I wish to speak about ourselves, because I think it's important for us to realize learning, our own learning, in order for us to support the learning of others. Because what I found is that the lack of the ability to realize my own learning stops me from being sensitive to the learning of others. And in this idea of natural learning, observation is key. We should not question when the unschooling is happening or whether there is any unschooling. We should question how the unschooling is happening. So, for instance, a child that has the ability to walk, for instance, just one day out of some weird form of way or curiosity or observation of us as adults in this space, decides, hey, today I'm going to get up. And the magic happens that moment in which they get up and they walk, and you find that they're motivated to walk to something or to reach for something, because that's the way the world works. Most things tend to be either, or the curiosity of a young person, most things tend to be out of reach. So learning to walk is functional. It's a functional aspect of our lives that we need to, but we so happen to learn, and we need to learn in order to grasp and function in the world. And that is how learning naturally takes place, or one example of how learning naturally takes place. We can also begin to talk about language assimilation and how, in our context in South Africa, we find, specifically in low-income areas where everybody's squashed together, where you got a mix of people staying together. So you got a mix of people, a mix of cultures, and gladly a mix of languages. And the young people in our area, we stay in the centers in an area called Bertrams. If you had to Google that on Google Maps, you will see that it was one of the first cities to start Johannesburg, and also has turned toward now a very impoverished community that's dealing with a lot of gentrification and a lot of jazz. But that's not the point. The point is that there's a bunch of people here who are promised this sort of sensational idea of when they come to Johannesburg. It's treated very similar to New York, that if they come to South Africa or if they come to Johannesburg, the first place you come to is our area and hopefully something will happen. So you got stacks of people from all over Africa that are staying here. And what I found in observation is that a child in our community by the age of 7 or 10 has learned French, English, Zulu, and their specific mother tongue. And that's non-institutional education. So one questions, what is the motivations to learn this? And we find that the motivations to learn this is to solely function in society, to solely know more, to solely learn more, to solely interact. And it's nothing that is forced, it's nothing that is beaten. It's actually sort of a spark of curiosity that motivates this intrinsic sense of learning. And for me, that is probably the most, the one of the examples that bring about the most magic of learning. It validates that learning is not something that happens, that is locative to a site. So it's not locative to a place and it's not locative to a time. Learning is just as breathing. There's actually no breathing without learning, and there's no learning without breathing. It is one and the same thing. So, unschooling with this idea or this theory that learning is natural. What does this look like? I think for a lot of us as unschoolers, we speak about two things in this journey, and that is trust and observation. So I think it was Akila Richards, one of the big writers and contributors to content creation around unschooling, specifically focused on POC communities, speaks about the idea that apparently in society, children are not to be trusted, children are liars, and children steal. What? How is this possible? A typical example is that when you walk into a room and maybe you find a child eating something that they weren't supposed to, they can quickly look at us and realize that they're probably doing something that they shouldn't. So that is going to be met with resistance, and they will say, you will ask, did you eat this? And they will say, no. So that's one example of how children are liars. And play with me with this thinking for now. We're going to disrupt it. You will then ask them another question, basically, who allowed you, or something authoritative or something controlling, and they will be able to assimilate their behavior according to your response. It's even said that when you tell a child you're lying, look at your face tells me you're lying, they realize that they have to now meet you with a different face if they want to convince you of a certain truth. So there's these massive psychological developments and learning and manipulations truly that are happening within all young people. And being sensitive, once again, observing to how this shows up, one can quickly account for some radical learning. And it's been a mind-blowing journey for me thus far to see how young people have the ability to they might not know the words that we have or they have the language that we have, but they have the ability to reciprocate, they have the ability to manipulate, they have the ability to be sensitive, and they have the ability to forgive. So taking a world that sees children as liars, stealers, untamed, needing to be tamed, we find that all of these characteristics are reflections of how we treat young people, that they choose to show up and behave in certain ways because of how we as a society treat them. I want to pause on that thinking and just let that simmer for 2 seconds because we're going to come back into it. Just yeah, let it just simmer. So I want to go back to schooling. We're going to come back to the whole nature of learning and everything I just said, specifically the unschooling and navigating natural learning or unschooling. I just want to firstly just talk about schooling. So John's Holt utilization of the word unschooling, I feel is, and a lot of people might be very, might say it's very reactionary, and that there's no schooling without, or there's no unschooling without schooling. So it's a word that tends to be in conflict or in conversation with a lot of things. And in my research, I went to go research what does schooling mean. What is the etymology of the origin of this word schooling? And what I found is that the word schooling actually means leisure. It's what happens outside of work was schooling, according to the origin of this word or the original meaning of this word. So during this word came to be during the Greek time of philosophy, and it was, I think if we look at a lot of Greek books and Greek writings, one looks at how there was this time for work and servitude of the community, and there was this time in which there would be great debates and arguments where people would pose ideas to each other, and it wouldn't be something that would be unique to an institution. It would be something that would happen in a common area of that specific culture or that specific group. So this interaction in leisure and exchange of information would be regarded as schooling in the context of the root word. However, I just want to find this mouse quickly. I just want to read you a quick little piece as to what uh, schooling is according to our sources of today. Specifically, looks talking about how schooling began to show up the way it shows up today. So the idea and practice of universal public education developed gradually in Europe from the earliest 16th century on into the 19th century. In America, in the mid 17th century, Massachusetts became the first colony to mandate clearly stated purpose of to mandate schooling. And it clearly stated that the purpose of schooling was to turn children into good putrons. The word putrons means holy people. So if we look at that Greek idea of the word schooling compared to what the colonial idea of schooling, we can see there's a big difference that schooling became seen as something that needed to happen to young people in order to make them putrons, in order to make them pure, in order to make them in service to something that they weren't apparently doing. We can also see how schooling could be used for detrimental colonial aspects, such as civilizing natives or creating a workforce or creating believers in a certain systematical aspect. Uh, in the African context of schooling, the goal of education, of the education system in Africa, that is in ancient Africa, was not seen sorry, let me just take a breath. The goal of education systems in ancient Africa was not seen primarily as the acquisition of knowledge, but rather it was seen as the progress through successful stages of rebirth to become very close to God. So, very different to the elements involved in the colonial era America as to the ends of schooling compared to the African context of schooling that saw schooling as knowledge needed to become more sensitive to living. The acquisition of knowledge in ancient Africa was done through engaging with nature, engaging with your community, and engaging with with the dream realm. This has changed completely in the African context. And the same, I'm not sure how it changed, the ends have changed compared to the schooling, compared to what the colonials have created out of schooling. We can go a step further in time and we can start to look at the industrial era and how the industrial era has influenced schooling. So schooling for the industrial era was made to create a workforce that would serve the political and capitalistic needs of those who are in power. I would also like to make the difference between the societal needs compared to your humane needs. We found that societal needs, so first of all, society is not something that happens by your permission. You don't give no consent to fall part of society. Society is something you are born into and you have to follow according to what society says. However, community is something you decide for yourself, and community is something you create for yourself. That is what you find within people and in different spaces. And you find that the societal needs and your human needs come into question with regard to specifically just looking at learning. You find that in our context in South Africa, there was this huge fascination on maths and sciences being made important. Hence, that is given more time hours compared to subjects like life skills or physical education. Those things aren't, or art specifically, those things aren't deemed important. I would also like to speak on the facultization of subjects within the schooling mind. So what do I mean when I say the facultization of subjects? I mean that there is no interconnectedness between what you are doing and what you are learning. I would also like to highlight the violence and the sort of hierarchy with teachers and subjects. In my experiences within the schooling environment, the English teacher, the maths teacher, and the science teacher were given more authority and were higher valued than the teachers that taught art and the teachers that taught life orientation and the teachers that taught any other subjects that were not included in those first three. And one could see by the nature of how young people behaved towards these teachers, one could see by the nature of the workload that these teachers sometimes required or they enforced more respect than at other times compared to other teachers. And this was an absolute chaos for a young person's brain because you see not only classism, but you see a hierarchy in the system of schooling. And when that hierarchy gets played out by young people within the schooling system, I'm talking about the playground, you start to see that there's certain kids that form a hierarchy and they use things like bullying as a tool. They use these tools of oppression that is practiced by the adults in the space to then co-create this culture of schooling and the oppressive nature of the system. And you find how play begins to mutate into some form of assimilation or some form of pretending to be exactly like the adults who are in that specific environment. So here we can begin to probably relate to some of our own experiences and experiences that we have experienced in younger people or stories that we might have heard about certain consciousnesses that exist within the schooling system and how if we really want to talk about humanity, if we really want to talk about social justice, we start to see that schools as they stand currently could be possibly a site of some heavy oppressive cultures, some heavy oppressive habits, and some heavy oppressive behaviors that result in the perpetuation of these challenges within the greater society. There's nothing that you won't see in a school that you won't see in the macrocosm of that country. And that is where our challenge lies. The fact that we are co-creating and we're creating a culture that reproduces itself, that does not only fail our human needs, it fails the earth and it fails our spirits. And that for me has been sort of also another one of the triggers that really made me go in and question the original ways of learning and how these practices showed up. I just want to lower my screen because I made some notes. So we spoke about now what influences the ends of schooling as it shows up today. And we made mention of the capitalistic nature as well as the economic nature of the world, and that we don't have any say in what is regarded as important. You as a mother, you as a household, you as parents might say to your young people, these things are important, you should know this, or you should know this, or you can try to support that learning. However, if it's put up against the context of schooling, it doesn't hold any ground. And that's what I've found to be very disruptive in young people's lives, that they have a split personality. And I think it's obvious. A child behaves a certain way in school and a child behaves a different way at home. With this whole COVID thing that's currently happening, a lot of a lot of parents that I've been engaging with have spoken to me about the nature of the young people when they are at home compared to what teachers state about the young people. And this is specifically just talking about what we regard as ADHD, what we regard as not being cooperative, what we regard as being a distraction or a disruption in class. All of these things don't show up at home with the parents I've been speaking to. And we question why it doesn't show up. Firstly, because home is our safe space. Home is where we become authentic. The first sensation of authentic people that we ever get happens within the comfort of being home. And from there, that has to be diminished, or that has to be cited, as we now have to change up and switch up for the culture of schooling. So we find ourselves jumping. It's a difference between, as adults, I think, who we are to each other in the home compared to who we are to each other in a workspace where there's a lot of competition, where there's a lot of tension. And one can see how dysfunctional some workspaces are that adopt that sort of heavy energy of being very under pressure, being very competition driven, basically all things that aren't natural to ourselves. So one more aspect in this sort of conversation about schooling is the de-academizing of learning. Unfortunately, the histories that we just spoke about, so specifically looking at the colonial era histories or the industrial era histories, have sort of created a sensation of book learning or headspace learning, that we learn in our heads, and that everything needs to be sensational to our eyes and head. It has to come from a book, or it has to come from some valuable source. This is where the conversation about de-academizing learning comes into play. I'll share a personal story in my life. So I have a grandmother who stays in some rural area, very far from the city. And she makes a traditional beer or a traditional brew. She has the ability, when she makes this brew, it stands for like 2 or 3 weeks, and she has the ability to go down and tap on the container. It's like a tin container, and she taps onto it, like just hits it, and it gives off a certain vibration, a certain sound. And she can tell whether the brew has a certain amount of alcohol in it, ready to be served, or whether it's still maturing. She can tell all of this by the sound it makes, which is absolutely mind-blowing. You're looking at a deeper sensitivity to, first of all, I don't know the academic terms for this, but there are a ton of academic terms for this. I'm talking about, like, I think liquid dissonance, resonance, how different liquids resonate in different bowls or vessels, and also talking about how alcohol surfaces, and then I don't know what, there's a different sound at the bottom and there's a different sound on top. And she taps the top and the bottom, and each sound tells you a different thing with regard to this process. Guess what, guys? My granny is uneducated according to our world. We have a system that devalues her education, her experiences, and her learning. Specifically looking at academia that deems natural learning or informal learning to be unvaluable. This is dangerous if we want to promote a culture of learning. I would like to believe In the quest of promoting a culture of learning, we need to create more learning opportunities. And I want us to sort of look at the household as a learning opportunity, family as a learning opportunity, funerals and weddings, as I suggested, to be learning opportunities. And in this walk of de-academizing learning, we have to come into conversation as to the colonial aspects of learning, or the colonial aspects that have disrupted the learning that has taken place. And we're looking at all aspects of what we call indigenous or ancestral learning, things that have happened before our modern times and that are still happening in some parts of the world right now. Actually, in all parts of the world, there's this idea of informal learning that's taking place. It happens currently right now. A lot of the young people had to begin navigating Zoom and Skype and emailing. And this wasn't something that we had a lesson for. It's something that like, oh, I had that natural intrinsic to want to join the Skype session, and they found ways and watched YouTube videos to join the session. And like all learning, I believe that their learning is valid. Their emotions are valid. Their experiences are valid. And once again, speaking as a child, not as something distant to us, but speaking to the child as a part of us that was silenced by the society. When we were told, a simple example, something that happened with my granny. I like to reference my family because it's real for me, and I believe things that aren't based in experience don't hold that much ground. Part of this academizing learning. Sorry, these words. So learning is valued however it shows up. A typical example of how I came into question with that was one day where I was busy playing the guitar, and it sounded horrible. And there was something that my granny said to me. She said that you better go fetch a book because you're never going to make money playing that guitar. Boom. It's like, what? Whoa, where did this come from? You know, one begins to get emotional and a lot of emotional disruptions happen. And one can't blame my granny for thinking the way she does. It's because of that same thinking that unless it comes from a book, unless it comes from something external to yourself, unless it comes from authority, it is not valid. And I think part of our unschooling journey is starting, and this is where it becomes social justice elements, starting to validate our human experience, not waiting for an article to be written, not waiting for no degree to be received, not waiting for any validation, but the unique idea that whatever we are learning is functional, is validation enough. I think that's important in this exploration of learning. And I think this could be a possible way for us to humanize learning. And that's what I would like to talk about next, the idea of humanizing learning. Why do I say humanizing? Do you want to pause on that? So it is clear that a lot of our human interactions have been disrupted by multiple aspects. Like I said, our natural way of learning has been disrupted. Our human way of learning has been disrupted. And it's not just the human way of learning, but the human way of living has been disrupted. Because learning is living. There's no living without learning. It's impossible. We have a day at the center that we experiment with once a year. It's called Learn Nothing Day. You know, we've never had the ability to learn nothing on this day. The idea of learning nothing is impossible. The mere ability for one person to talk to another and I say, yo, come and tell you about my day. That is learning. When you fall and you get up, that is learning. When you climb a tree, whether you pile books on top of each other, whether you're getting angry, whether you're feeling anxious, all of these moments are key and empirical spaces for learning. However, do we validate it? Do we see it as important? Nope. That is the reality. And I don't talk about you and us, you us in this call. I'm talking about the consciousness that exists that doesn't see this important. We don't see play to be important. So I believe in our sensitivity or our engagement with unschooling or natural learning, there comes a real question of the humanness of this learning and why this humanness of our nature, why this humanness of our learning is not regarded as important. It's not regarded as something that can take us into tomorrow. It's not regarded as something that can pave a way for a future generation to be better. And I think a lot of us begin, well, the rabbit hole starts to open firstly as to then what is the way we learn? And we tend to find that the way we learn tends to be mechanical. It tends to be beyond us. It can even be regarded to be inhumane. I like language. And there's a specific element of language that once you learn the word, you assimilate it. So taking all of us are confident speakers in this language of English. We have assimilated by adopting this language to describe and to explain ourselves, we have assimilated the word inhumane. So now exists a practice within all of us that could be considered to be inhumane, merely because we know the word. Crazy. And I have found that the danger of language, specifically within the way we use it, allows us to sometimes embody certain ideas that we don't necessarily need to, or we don't need to sort of be. And if we look at a lot of indigenous language, there's no such word as inhumane. It is impossible to be inhumane. It is impossible to be anything but yourself. But we find ourselves questioning young people and questioning what do they want to become as if they are nothing. I found that to be one of the dangers of engaging with young people, this question as to what you want to become. And I think it's the authority and the oppressive nature of us as adults to recognize that you are the oppressor. Me as an adult, Shivani, have oppressive tendencies. And one of them show up by asking young people what you want to become. Because by asking them what you want to become, I am stating that they are nothing. They are yet to become. And like I mentioned earlier, how us as a system begin to inform how they behave. As soon as they realize, like Leah, that they are nothing, that they are failures, we've messed up their humanity. We've messed up their learning. And like learning and living tend to be the same thing, we extensively begin to mess up their lives because they will now live a life always in question of what they are yet to become or what they are supposed to become. And myself, I find myself, I'm now at the age of 28, I'm still questioning what am I going to become because of the trauma of this question as to have I reached that stage yet? Am I becoming yet? Am I there yet? You know? And I try to look for that in my father. He's still becoming. I try to look for that in my mother. She's still becoming. My granny and my grandfather, all of them have not become yet. They have not done what was expected by that question, what you want to be or what you want to become. We are constantly in this life in process, as what was practiced in the African context of original education. It was not about the goal, it was all process driven. And I think looking at education, looking at unlearning, looking at learning as process definitely brings about some new navigations or some new questions into being audience to it or even being practicing it. I also want to now speak about learning and relationships. So maybe we're gonna have space, just to let everybody know, we're gonna have space for questioning and deeper focuses. I just want to sort of cover this bulk chunk of content and let that simmer and let that probably inform some of our questions and navigations around these topics. So learning and relationships. I think if we look at indigenous practices of learning, we find that learning always was something in context of those relationships you have around you. No relationships, and this is not relationships just strictly with human beings. This is relationships with the earth, relationships with the sky, and relationships extensively with the people around you. Relationships are learning. And that's, I think, a big thing that the schooling uh, aspect gets very wrong, is that we try to learn without building relationships. And it's basically impossible. It's difficult for you to learn from someone that there's no resonance with. If you look at how sound works, sound resonates with things that are very similar to it. So relationship in that similarity. And if sound could be information, information can't be passed from one vessel to the next without some form of resonance. And if we had to apply this physical theory to just the simple act of our human nature, that there's no learning without a relationship. And I think one of the hacks of schooling or hacks of learning would be to put relationships above any form of academia, to put relationship building above any form of state, what's this thing, state assessments, to put relationships above every form of any form of protocol that comes from anywhere external, to look at what we have with each other and with the earth and with the spaces, and look at those interactions as sites and opportunities for learning. Uh, a simple example of how relationships influence learning. I know that I'm not unique. Reason being, I can bet that everybody on this call has the ability to remember something that, or a lesson, for lack of better words, something or a lesson from your childhood experience where you never used any recitation, where you never used any highlighter, and you never used any book. It was something said to you by someone special or someone that you had a relationship with, that to this day you have the fondest of memory of what was said to you. Ooh, can I get just a thumb if this resonates with anybody? Can I just see some thumbs? See, so truly we are not unique in this. I'm not unique to say, yo guys, I'm the special person who has the ability to remember things from my childhood without highlighters and without pens. I can magically remember this. We're not unique in this. This is just the nature and the relationships of learning. And this is where we talk about an element of love, that we tend to remember from people that we love. We tend to remember, or at least becoming influenced or get sparked by people that we have some sort of resonance towards. And I think if in the idea of schooling, if the focus was on relationships, and I think it happens for some of us, if it never happened, I had one teacher that I had a great relationship with, and every day in that class never felt like day in school. It felt like a day with someone that I really enjoyed, someone's company who I really enjoyed. And that made, I never even had a book for that teacher. And she got very angry that I never had a book. But I passed all my exams with distinctions. And it was nothing to do with the studying. It was nothing to do with the content. It was the fact that this person I had a relationship with, and that deepened and broadened my curiosity and my learning. And I never had to do no reciting or studying. It was just something that naturally happens. And if one applies that same thinking of that special teacher to the special people in our lives, we begin to see that the more special people we have is the more learning that takes place. And I also don't want to limit it to people, but special places. I think all of us have a special place. And visiting that special place is like taking us to a sensation of heaven. And note, our experiences in this place inform our decision making, inform our learning. So we find that relationships, not only with space but with people, become extremely critical sites of learning and living. On this tip of learning and relationships, I do want to make mention of one thing that we spoke about recently, of how land informs learning. And if we speak about just the decolonization of learning, we find that a lot of people, native people, indigenous people from around the world have been stripped of their land. And part of stripping indigenous people of their land is stripping indigenous people not just of their language, but also of their culture, because we find that land has the ability to capacitate language and culture and education, truly, of course, because language and culture is but learning and education. So we had this weird time where, for a lot of aspects of this new world that we're emerging into, and uh, aspects of land and space, we're looking at how we can sort of create practices that are very similar to our indigenous ancestors, very similar to indigenous practices. And I believe that, I think, thank you for Oslam for being here. We spoke about it, and Oslam shared a story in a previous exploration that we had about how her grandparents would, when they go to the fields, they would harvest uh, a certain crop, and when they harvest a certain crop, uh, there would be an exchange in which the person who would need this crop to be harvested would then buy a huge bundle of cherries for everybody. And they would end up, the group that would be in the field harvesting would end up celebrating with the cherries, and it would be something that gets shared with the family. And also there was this sort of intrinsic idea of adults playing in the field. Uh, and if you look at the idea of relationships learning, you're looking at, first of all, the land that this collective was working in. And they weren't working in this for the sake of just economic benefit, but they were looking at working in this field as a space for them to supply food to their family. It was a relationship with the land capacitated family, the land capacitated living, the land capacitated learning. And I do want to for us to share this idea of the locativeness of learning, and how our context plays an important role with our learning. And that, I think, if there's no context to our learning, it becomes learning in an airspace. And that's what I talk about, that academic learning. It's just learning in your head. It's not learning in context. And to touch on that lightly, there's so much maths that I've learned in books. I failed grade 9 maths, uh, not because of any reason for me being stupid or not in, what's this word? Dyscalculia, that's apparently a word a lot of psychologists use that they put on young people. Terrible. Uh, it was because there was no experience in what I was doing. It was all abstract. And academics require a great imagination, a great imagination. So if anybody of you are still in school or having young people in school, I advise watching a lot of animation movies, watching a lot of sci-fi movies, just to get that abstract thinking into your brain, that imaginative thinking into your brain, because that is a big part of what academics require from you. It requires you to take yourself out of your life and put yourself somewhere that is irrelevant to anything that you are doing. And imagination is key for that. Unfortunately, that imagination is used destructively in the context of schooling, because that imagination it isolates you, it makes you, first of all, a number, and it makes you compete. So people that you would regard friends or build relationships with, guess what? We're all fighting for number one spot, and the number one spot does not even exist. So the next part about it. So I just wanted to wrap up that idea of relationships, and how relationships are broad, relationships are open, and relationships include space. It's not locative to people. I think part of those relationships, I like to now talk about the context of communities being the spaces of learning. And for those new to unschooling, one of the big questions is, what about maths? What about the sciences? Will my young people ever be able to grasp these ideas? Because for a lot of us, like Leah's example, a lot of us think about these abstract subjects out of context. We never see maths in our day-to-day lives. We never see reading in our day-to-day lives. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, reading looks like something that happens with a book. That's the only way. If it's happening on the internet, if it's happening reading emails or reading advertisements or reading the trucks, unfortunately, is not validated. And that's the cool thing about unschooling, is that you don't have to believe those forms of validation that are external to you. You can actually see it happening when it's happening. So a typical example with regard to that maths question that so happens to come up a lot from people who are new to this term unschooling. So there's this big thing that says maths is important, maths is everywhere and part of life. But why is it that maths is limited for young people to be only in textbooks or in school? No idea. The idea is that, once again, the abstract thinking, we have to now go into our imaginations to imagine maths. But maths is in our day-to-day lives. A typical example is that if one had to sort of dissolve our authority over money and allow young people to join us in our excursions to the shops, or allow young people to exchange monies here and there, take responsibility for shopping, comparing prices, we start to now dismantle this idea of the locativeness of learning. Learning now becomes part of our life. And like the beautiful theory that says maths is everywhere, maths begins to look a lot more friendly here and starts to show up in more places, such as at a store, comparing prices, choosing how much money to take when you go to the market, choosing how to negotiate, choosing to sell things at different points in their lives, providing these opportunities for young people to engage in the real world instead of the real world being as abstract to them as their reality. By starting to validate and acknowledge the realness of their experiences, we begin to allow them to participate in the real world that is supposed to be promised once you're 18, or once you have a varsity degree, or once you graduate from high school, or wherever you're supposed to graduate from. The real world becomes literally a real world. Everywhere, all the time. It's nothing external to you. And I think for a lot of new unschoolers, it's about building that bridge between the content and your life. To realize that your life is content enough. Your experiences is content enough. You knowing is extremely valid. You have, I mean, as a parent, you've lived for about, I don't know how old everybody is on this thing, but I can guarantee within the first 5 minutes of living, you're already starting to account, you already start to fill your bucket or fill your bowl with experiences. So imagine by the time you hit 20, how many experiences you have. Imagine by the time you hit 50, how many experiences you have. And just because these experiences never happened within an institution does not mean they are not valid. And I think that was one of the biggest heartaches for me in my life. Even jumping on the school, I I sort of, just excuse me, I got some puppies over here. They're making a noise. Just, you can just let them in. Okay, yeah. So like I was saying, is that I think for a lot of us as adults, we've been told for way too long that we're invalid. We've been told for way too long that we are not important, or that we're not skilled enough. Hence, even the idea in some context of parenting, it's abstract. Parenting seems like something that has to be, I don't know. There are a lot of false ideas with regard to parenting, and all of them devalue anything that is currently happening. Just 2 seconds, my screen just went down. Can I just move for them quickly? Sorry about that. But yes, so a lot of unschooling, once again, like I said, it starts with us. Once we start to see ourselves as valid, and I'm talking about that child that was silenced, I'm talking about that child that was deemed invaluable, if that's the correct English word. Once we begin to heal that relationship with ourselves, validating our knowing, validating our experiences, we begin to become not only active learners, but active teachers. And the idea of teaching becomes not something that happens with a degree. The idea of a teacher is part of life, just like the idea of parenting. If we had to come back to that idea, parenting is not something that happens when you have children. I mean, I grew up in a community where I was disciplined and I was informed by a lot of adults who weren't my parents. I used to leave the home in the mornings, especially during school holidays, and I would walk to different families, different houses, walk in the streets, and there would be still this parental aspect by all of these people, from older brothers to aunties to different human beings that were in our community. I can regard them all to be parents, because for me the idea of parenting is someone that influences, supports, and loves. Someone that influences, supports, and loves. And I found all of this within my community. I never realized it because I devalued it, and I wasn't sensitive to it. And I wish I could go back, not to change anything, but just to be more sensitive to those moments in which my learning was actually happening. And I look at those experiences now and I celebrate them. I celebrate them tremendously. I celebrate all those elders. I celebrate all those interactions. And only sad, it's only very sad that according to academia, that those people who played such an empirical role in my life, who were so valuable to a lot of my learning, were never honored, because honoring was unique to the institutions that are trying to regenerate and recreate a culture that is focused on, first of all, valuing, trying to quantify human life and death simply. So I think before we go into some questions, I just want to talk about the last part, and this is the spirituality of unschooling. I think for a lot of us, getting to this point is the start of starting to question a lot of things in our life. And I think we need to start to look at learning as a sacred act, learning as an act of spirituality. Why do I say this? Because I think for a lot of us, the magic of life has been taken out. We've been stripped of that. Uh, Magic tends to only exist in these sci-fi realms or in animated realms. And for me, once I started to realize the sacredness to my learning, for it to be spiritual, uh, it has began. It creates this. I think I use the word spiritual to talk about that innate magic that happens when we learn something, such as a young person learning their first words, or a young person learning to walk, or even that aha moment where you just get something out of the blue. You weren't even busy with it, but it just happens. Uh, the sacredness and the spirituality to us joining. Imagine, during this time, we all have very similar questions. We all come from different parts of the world, but our questions are very similar. For me, and it's a learning experience. This whole webinar is a learning experience. And for me, as a spiritual being, to be present with everybody else here is definitely an act of spirituality. It is beyond me to even comprehend where everybody is at this moment, never mind time zones and the fact that we're going through the eclipse today and the solar equinox. It's like a lot of crazy magical things happening. And why not celebrate it like young people celebrate the magic of life? Why are we distant from that magic? Why is the magic only for young people? And I think that's a big part of parenting and unschooling. Once again, just observing and being sensitive to it, is that I think there's a slight envy that a lot of adults have with young people, specifically looking at the freedom and the magic that they have. And I think a lot of our authority and oppressive nature is strongly rooted in a small sense of envy as to the magic that still continues to exist within them. And because we don't understand, and this magic is so foreign to us because of our trauma with it, we begin to what's the word? Practice what we've been taught. And this practice, once again, regenerates that same culture that unfortunately is not doing no human no good. And yes, so these are part of my ideas as to how we can begin to hack recreate, and heal not just schooling, but learning. Not just, once again, this is not something that changes one person's life. It's contextual, and it raises consciousness, it heals. And that's why I like to bring in this element of social justice, because I feel that schooling is doing a humanitarian social injustice. We are not anymore seen as humans. However, our quest for creating spaces for natural learning, our spaces of validating all sorts of learning, a space to promote and support learning, however it shows up, is part of social justice work. Because I think we have to realize that we come from an intense oppression. I mean, if you look at how children are treated, the word child or childish is used as a weapon. If I had to describe anyone on this chat to be childish, it is met with some level of trigger. So what have we done as a society? That we've weaponized being a child. We've weaponized being innocent. We've weaponized being magical. And yeah, that's why I relate it to social justice, because I feel that part of us emerging in this new world, and I think even more so for a lot of people, our emergence is questioning a lot of what the COVID thing has brought into our, has highlighted. The COVID has done nothing new in this world. It has just highlighted everything that has been messed up, and now we're going to have to deal with it. And I think a lot of adults, a lot of parents, a lot of people in education have been given our time and space to start thinking about our practices, to start thinking about our living, to start thinking about our learning. And it's at this time of this emergence of this chaos that we have the ability to deal. And I think it's very important for us to have these conversations and to start dealing with living and learning, as this new world is requiring us to do that. Because I don't think the new world is going to be as I don't think like the new world is going to be any different unless we have these conversations, unless we co-create and be courageous to go against the grain. But the grain is no more there, but to move forward and to push our human nature, to push forward our human living, and to push forward our human learning. It just so happens for our context that it shows up as unschooling or natural learning. And I think it's on that we can uh, open up and start to discuss this thing further. I thank you very much for everybody for listening for me for such a long time. But I would like to maybe engage with some of the questions and maybe like just unpack some of these ideas. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or to shout.
Hi. I wanted to write, but it was going to take long, so I just get inside. So when you were talking about the relationship and learning, that remind me something that I recently talked with a friend. She was, it was about a tale of Anderson, the tale of the teapot. The teapot is not happy with the broken parts, but something like that. So we were talking about why we are not loving our broken parts and why, how we can make peace with ourselves and love ourselves so that we can grow and love the others around us. So while we were talking on this tale, we discovered, I mean, it come out that when we start to know someone and know its nature, like the capacities and the potential and the the things that are difficult for him or her, that time we can find a way to realize our and their own potential and capabilities and everything, so that we can help them to be more free, I mean, to liberate themselves. So that was something that we end up saying, that friendship and freedom is connected. I think I talked too much, but I wanted to, it was a really long conversation, and it was started with that tale, but that's something like you were talking about magic, and that conversation was something magical between us. I mean, we two as friends, and that we needed each other, and we were trying to discover and explore our capacities, and that kind of thing. So it came up that this relationship makes both of us free, more free than we were before. I think that's the same thing with unschooling and the relationship with young people and the adults around us. I think these relationships liberate all of us. So that was something that I wanted to share, and thank you for all the things you have mentioned and hosting this conversation.
Thank you very much for that, Oslam. And yes, indeed, relationships, like, they're so underrated, and a lot of us have been we weren't given time and space to develop these natural relationships, because in the context of schooling, these relationships are forced upon us, and they tend to be rooted in either authority or power. And I think a lot of the relationships that we form today, I'm talking about let's talk about simple male-female relationships. As a male, I know there exists a consciousness where males have adopted this authority and power, not only over the land, but over other human beings. Hence, we have this thing of people working for people and never with people. There's a big difference between the two. The difference between working for someone involves power and authority. When you dissolve that, you begin to work with people. And I think a future of working with each other, living with each other, learning with each other, loving one another, is a future in which there's abundant learning that has the ability to change our trajectory as humans, like, crazily. Thank you very much for that, Oslam. If there's any other questions? Open to that.
No question. Thank you, first of all, for sharing all of that. That was really great. I'm curious if you could just speak more about how you see some of this ideology in practice. Like how your relationships with young people, like what kind of, just how that looks. And like what, maybe like for yourself, or like other models that you see in other places where more natural learning is happening, and where a more relational, liberatory approach to learning.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much for the question. And yes, more ways in which this element of unschooling, or the practicality of it and how it shows up. I think there's two elements. I can speak from an adult perspective, and I can also speak from engagements with young people. I think I'll speak on both for now. Let's start with adults. So as Osam just said, that in the simple relationship as friends, or for instance, maybe my relationship with my parents, what unschooling has helped me with is, first of all, just with regard to parents, my personal parents, I've tend to move away from seeing my parents the same way I saw my teachers, as superheroes, or the same way I saw anybody that had authority or power over me. We tend to see them in these golden temples, meaning that they need to show up in a certain way, and anything that disrupts this idea, my imagination of how they're supposed to show up, I deny and reject. And that makes learning very, 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 very dangerous, because we tend to block what learning actually is and how learning actually shows up because of a dysfunctional relationship. So what unschooling has helped me with is to realize my parents as learners, to realize my parents as being part of a process. Even now, when I'm at the age of 28 and they are whatever ages they are, we are still learning. I never see my parents as being righteous in the idea of what state or authority calls righteous. I see my parents as having the opportunity to be wrong and right. There's sort of this levelness to our relationship. It's no more based in authority and power. And for a good time of my childhood, it has been based on authority and power. And my parents have found everything that my parents never wanted us to learn from them, we learned. And everything that they were trying to promote us to learn, we had a hard time learning because there was resistance with that, just due to this dysfunctional relationship. So there's also one aspect of relationships that gets messed up, and I think it's across the board. I can now relate this to younger people and my engagements with younger people, and how the importance of relationships in the context of unschooling, that once again is solid in trust. Trust is a big element in unschooling. How this shows up, I'll give an example. At the center the other day, not the other day, post-COVID or pre-COVID, sorry. One of the young people were jumping on the trampoline and they were doing the most crazy acrobatics, back flips, front flips. And they so happened to have the mats off. After I've made requests that, guys, I really would appreciate if you guys keep the mats on, because underneath the mats are these sharp-ended metal bars. So I was coming from a very fear-based form of thinking. We have a relationship, but it's a new young person in the center. So we have this theory of 1,000 mistakes, that before you become officially a Reimagined learning member, you have to first make 100 mistakes. That just like debunks or disrupts that relationship element of I'm supposed to be the perfect child, or because this is how young people apparently need to show up for adults. They constantly need to be impressing adults with certain things that they doing. So this takes away from them being their authentic person, because they forever acting to what we expect them to behave like. So back to the example. Mana was doing backflips, a crazy amount of backflips. And I ran out and I felt the fight or flight in me build up, and I went to him and I weaponized my voice and I said, "Hey," like loud projectile. And I saw how my words like a spear hit him. And as he landed his backflip, because of my projectile voice, it hit him and he took 2 steps back and he almost fell, creating the sensation or the moment that I was so afraid of. Because of me, it happened. I projected it. I literally projected it. If I had trust that he was going to land and everything was going to be okay, I wouldn't have disrupted his meditative practices of doing his backflips. So an example of how sort of my relationship with myself and the distrust I have with myself has affected his meditation, in him bettering himself in his learning, because of my pre-contained judgments, my lack of trust in his moment, and my lack of trust that he partially is sort of at peace with where he's at and he knows, he's aware. I never accredited him. I never saw him to be that. I saw him to be an ignorant child that needs to listen to me. And that is our mistake as adults and my mistake in that moment, that I needed to trust him. Another example, I think Oslam and I spoke about this example in another exploration. Young people, you walk into a room and there's these soft, big, fat couches. Young people have this intrinsic way of learning where they go to those couches and they start jumping on them. And for us, it's the biggest act of disruption. It's the biggest act of betrayal. We're like, oh no, what are you doing? Not on the couch, don't jump on the couch, not jumping. But we're not willing to acknowledge that this is a very sensitive form of physics taking place. Probably the type of physics that could be expected in a Harvard lecture. This young person is sensibly looking at this couch and realizes this couch to be full of springs and soft, and finds this learning journey through feeling it with their buttocks and experiencing that bounce. Say, whoa, this thing's actually soft. It increases my bounce each time. It actually projects me up. And we as adults, we don't see this. We see it as disruption. We see it messed up. We see it worse behavior. However, you'll never see a young person do that same thing to a slab of bricks. Why is it that they don't do it to a slab of bricks? What possible reason could there be? It's because there's a knowing that those bricks are hard and those bricks are going to hurt me. However, this is not the same for this couch in question. This couch in question seems to be something that it could be enjoyable. And learning as enjoyable is something that's a threat to society, because learning is not supposed to be enjoyable. Learning, like work, needs to require your focus, your concentration, and no distractions. And that is not what learning naturally is. Learning naturally is this exploration that could be disruptive and that could disrupt us, especially as adults coming from a schoolish mindset. So it's being extra sensitive to hold our judgments on what learning is, and to sort of rather be at peace and to show how, or to support, or to be sensitive to how learning is showing up. I have this thing that it's a practice of mine. Before I make a judgment upon a situation, and this is any situation with adults or young people or even the environment, I just have 5 seconds for myself to simmer with what I'm judging. So instead of having that easy reaction, having that easy access to that reaction, I just sit and pause 5 seconds. And I question, where is this emotion coming from? Is this emotion coming from a place of love, or is it coming from a place of fear? And it's in that questioning that I have the ability to find if I'm supporting somebody or if I'm projecting something that doesn't even exist. So those are some examples in how I experience learning in the element of relationships, and how relationships inform this unschooling or learning that's happening. It's very difficult. I can't say there's an easy way to approach this, because a lot of it is just to do with our healing and holding space for a sense of knowing that we are not used to. Because we know something is happening. Trust me, no human has this innate sort of wanting to be triggered, or want to be upset with everything that is happening around us. We actually want to see light in most things. And I think starting the work to want to see the learning, or wanting to see the unschooling before we claim it to be unschooling or natural learning, just having that eye for it, because learning unschooling doesn't just happen outside of school. Unschooling happens in schools. It can happen. It's possible. Young people engage on the playground or engage in hallways. They speak to each other. They inform each other about each other's lives. They inform each other about things that's happening. So unschooling doesn't seem to deem schooling to be wrong. We just realize that there are some elements of this system that doesn't see us as people. And we need to start seeing ourselves as people in order to start fixing our people issues. And part of this projection, or part of this process of fixing our people issues, is to hold space to raise free people, because we don't want to be putting our shit, for lack of better words, onto these people. We don't want to be putting our traumas, and that's what happens currently in a lot of systematical systems of education, is that it's just a complete reproductive cycle of this ill culture, and nothing ever gets changed. There is very few elements of resilience. Like I say, unschooling doesn't seem to be against schooling. We are against the nature of how it shows up, and everything that's oppressive, everything that doesn't see us as human, everything that doesn't recognize indigenous peoples and indigenous practices to be valued, that is messed up. So unschooling is a one route of addressing these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. I think, yeah, I'm kind of in a place now where I'm I have lost probably all of my hope for schools being places where learning really happens. So, yeah, it's interesting to just think about like the alternatives. I think the tension that I sometimes feel is that I get worried about my students or the young people in my life. I'm just curious about like helping them understand the context that they're in and like the violence that they're in, and not like, is that's a criticism that I sometimes have. There's a free school down the street from my house.
Preschool.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I as an outsider, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I worry that some of the hierarchies that just naturally exist in our world, when they're not addressed amongst young people, then they are still recreated. So I'm curious, like, also about that. Not just like the hierarchies between kids, but yeah, just like how to help them integrate, knowing that like we are trying to create something otherworldly in a world that is like really working against that.
I think a big space to draw inspiration could be uh, spaces in which there are communities that are practicing certain values or certain just ways of seeing the world. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of people, without having a reference, it's like speaking to a person in a Inuit or someone that stays in a space where there's a lot of snow, speaking to them about the desert. It's out of context and they have to sort of use their imagination. And for a lot of people in school who have known nothing other, and I'm talking about a generational aspects of knowing nothing other, it becomes very difficult. And but I do think what I found in that my relationships with people or young people that do go to school is that there's multiple aspects. First of all, the fact that they don't look you in your eyes, they're not willing to engage. There's a lot of social anxiety with regard to old people, whereas unschoolers sort of don't have that, because that's why a lot of people say that homeschoolers or unschoolers have social issues. There's no social issues. Our social issues are social actions. We engage with old people, we engage with young people. There's no seeing anyone as subhuman or superior human. We see human. Or a lot of the thinking, no, I only speak for our context of unschooling. You'll find in your investigation that there are so many forms of unschooling. It's like a whole world. But in our form, that's specifically due to do with liberative practices, we try to see everybody as human. And it's on that basis that we form our engagements. However, if you come from a context where you've been deemed subhuman for a good part of your life, the work becomes even very more difficult to just recognize just the oppression firstly, and then to begin the walk to liberation. However, I have seen spaces to be influential of this thinking, and maybe not people, but also spaces where conversations are brought up on learning and validation of this learning, uh, whereas other spaces tend to deny those same conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky in the context of any institution that exists in the world that we're in, because we are still forced into capitalism in some ways, and people are still paying money to get access to that space, and that's like a whole complicated thing.
And I think that's also one of the things that I've put a lot of work into disrupting, that for a lot of people, the idea of unschooling is something that's limited to a specific class, specifically a very affluent class, and specifically tends to be something associated with more white people. And if we look at it really, as I explained, that this idea of unschooling is actually just a simple indigenous practice of raising people. It's nothing new. There's nothing new. That's why I think there's this intuitive resonance with it, because we're not talking about anything abstract. We're talking about something that exists within our genetic memory. You know, it's not something that we're reintroducing. There's nothing new about unschooling. I denounce any thinking about it that sees it as brand new or a in thing. It's not that. It's a restorative practice. unschooling as a restorative practice, restoring and liberating our existence. And I think maybe that could be probably a way to navigate conversations into recognizing or validating learning that happens without institutions, with engaging young people. Maybe young people 10 and above, is to have these conversations as to, do you regard learning that happens at home any more important than learning that happens in school, and why? And then we can begin to unpack why. And 10 to 1, you find that the learning in school is highly valued because of economic benefit. But then we start to question, is economic benefit living? Is economic benefit life? How many people are happy? How many people have community that have economic benefit?
Yeah, that no makes total. I'm with you. I think I also start thinking about like two things. One is like how much so many of the parents of my students are like indoctrinated into that thinking about economic benefit, and then also just for students who have really traumatic home environments that they don't that they can't access that kind of learning, or if they do, it's very limited or complex. Which I obviously don't have control over that, but. And I don't blame those parents. Like I think that's a result of systemic issues. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult space to be in an institution and to have the knowing, or have begun the rabbit hole, begun entering the rabbit hole of the questioning and the healing essentially of the process of learning. Because I think, taking someone like yourself, I really resonate a lot to it, because that's how I started. I was academically trained to be a teacher, and I found myself having more relationships with young people than being an actual teacher or anything of authority. And I chose that consciously not to be that, because that wasn't helpful to me at any point in my life. I actually, still today, if people tell me that I should do something, or I'm met with any force or authority, I tend to have this rejection, immediate rejection to it. And I'm in the process of healing that, because a lot of people that mean good to me sometimes don't have the language to relate what they say. And so it's also a sense of sensitivity that I need to heal, to have these conversations and to make peace with these conversations. So I can relate to being in the school, and it's like being in the butcher, in the butcher or the abattoir, where you literally see how dreams are being smashed. But I do think that your mere presence and your mere questioning within these spaces create the change already, because already just that one question that you might ask, or the simple conversation that might, you have young people eavesdrop on that conversation, starts to create a domino effect. I think a lot of the work was trusting what we are doing when we are not doing it, and that is learning, trusting the learning to happen when it is not happening. And that also holds room for things to show up in different ways. So like you said, you're dealing with a context where there's maybe a household that is not very supportive, or you're dealing with a schooling system that is not very supportive. I think that could be, it could stand a chance to be the perfect canvas to make someone at some moment very sensitive to what you have to say, because you got the negative, and it's a negative we need to make the positive. So like I'm only here because of my traumas in schooling, and I haven't been unschooled, I had to go on that journey myself, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Truth be told, I wouldn't have it any other way. I do see a lot of things that were messed up in my life. However, I think for it to be, like I say, anything that's not rooted in experience doesn't hold any ground. And I'm thankful, and I have utmost gratitude for the experience thus far, because now when I do speak to young people, when I do speak to people in spaces that are slightly oppressive, there's a resonance, there's a relatability. It's not like I'm speaking as an academic from a space, as an alien from the heavens that have come now to save. No, I'm not here to save nobody. I'm here to just maybe spark a few questions. And I think you being in the position that you are is ideal for the mad question asking, and the conversation, or the sparking.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's deep also because I started out with first graders, like 6-year-olds, and then I was with like 6 and 7, and then 9 and 10, and now I'm with 11 and 12. And it's deep to see as I've moved older, like how much of their spirit is like less and less and less. And that's also a big thing that has informed my thinking about it. And it's really tragic, but I do think, yeah, it's important to hold that space within these institutions, because that's where the juxtaposition can teach a lot, I think, too.
The chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
Embrace the chaos. I think a lot of unschoolers will tell you that even at home, the same thing happens at home. I mean, when we go on excursions as a collective, we are still met with that same nature of spaces where they ask, "Oh, what grade are you in? Oh, because you're in grade, you get treated with this way." And that's a heavy form of resistance that we face even as unschoolers. But it's sort of this experience that allows us to really create the practicality and the criticalness of what we need to experience. Because now a 5-year-old has been asked all these funny questions by elders as to what grade you in, and now they have the language to actually approach that elder as to, I don't want to be anything. I am, I am this, I am that, and I am happy. Most importantly, so
Yeah.
what's cool is that just that the resistance allows for, it's like composting. The shit allows for the seeds. It provides all that nutrients and it provides all of that. So I believe that the composting is important. We mustn't negate the chaos. We mustn't negate the negativity, or we need to negate the oppression. Truly, 100%. However, I think it's to be sensitive to it in order for it to guide us out.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of young people within school, I mean, there was no one in my school thinking the way you do, I think if there was someone at least just to spark an idea or to have a slight, put a little pin in my mind with regard to my thinking, it would have major cause and effect. So I think it's like if we were soldiers at war, which a lot of conversation might even make us think that very more real than what we think. I think you are at the forefront, you in the battle line, and that's where a lot of the big action and a lot of the big changes happen. It's like having an inside agent to the work. And I think also in your journey, in as a because these are liberative practices, this is a walk of liberation, that you all also be able to better grasp a language and a knowing from what is actually happening compared to speaking out of book knowledge.
Yeah, and I think it's deep how it's like the kids who resist their own schooling the most, like who are most in touch with their spirits, are the ones that like get kicked out, they end up in jail, they end up, and then the ones who are the most attached to schooling are the ones who become teachers, because the amount of schooling that you have to like get to even become in that position, it's like such a cycle. So I'm curious about disrupting that.
Big ups on that.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, thanks. Well, thank you so much for this. It was very helpful. I'm going to bring a lot of what you said back to my crew of other folks thinking about this here.
See,
So,
thank you very much for showing up, and hope you have I'm not sure what time is it, but in our context, hope you have a blessed evening.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, it's only 3 here, but almost evening.
Okay, thank you very much, and look to chat soon again.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.